Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and today we're going to look at the Keynesian aggregate supply curve or the Keynesian model. And before we begin dissecting the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, let's first look at how it came into being. And we're going to use the monetarist model to illustrate this. So throughout the 19th century, the monetarist model was the dominant model. And in that model, as we've seen in a previous video, we're measuring the price level on the y-axis. So we'll make a note of that. Price level, or the average price of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. And on the x-axis, we're measuring the quantity of productive output, which we measure as real GDP, which is measuring spending equal to income equal to the value of output. In the Mattress Model, we have a perfectly inelastic long-run aggregate supply curve that we're going to label LRAS, long-run aggregate supply curve. And we have an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS1. And we're going to have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which we're going to label AD1. So we've seen this before, and the intersection of LRAS with SRAS and AD provides us with a price level at PL1. And we're at full employment. We're fully employing our factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And because we have full employment of resources, this is the ideal amount of output that we should be producing. So we're at full potential GDP. Y is the symbol for income. Income equal to spending equal to output. And we're at full potential GDP. So everything's going pretty good at this point. And we're going to label that point A. Okay? Now, in 1929, we had the beginning of the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in the United States. And when the stock market crashed, consumer spending started to fall. So we're going to remember that AD equals consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And in the Great Depression, as firms began to fire labor and people lost confidence in the economy, consumption spending started to fall. And since firms were selling less output and gaining less revenue, they were hesitant to increase their investment spending. So actually investment spending was falling. And so that leads to aggregate demand decreasing. Okay, so we have an inward shift of the aggregate demand curve from 81, let's say, to 82. Okay. And as we've seen in the previous video, that would take us to this point here, point B. The intersection of SRAS1 with 82 generates a lower price level at PL2, with GDP falling to, we'll call it Y recession. Income at recession. Income equal to spending equal to output. So monetarists, classical economists, stated that in the 1930s, this is what we would expect. And the data did show that we did have a fall in real GDP, so that was achieved. But what wasn't seen was the decrease in the price level that was expected in this model. Okay? And what appeared to be happening was the price level was stuck. So instead of the price level falling from point A to point B, it was actually going to point D. All right, the price level was sitting at this point. So Keynesian economists, John Maynard Keynes, and an economist that followed his development of the field of macroeconomics, were observing that part of the reason why the price level is falling was due to certain levels of government intervention and other forces. So for example, number one, in the 20th century, we have minimum wage legislation. Okay? And minimum wage prevents wages from falling below a particular point. So when the economy went into recession, legally, firms could not reduce wages, and that was preventing the SRAS curve from shifting downward. So that's a potential explanation as to why the price level wasn't falling, why it was sitting at point D. Other things that were beginning to happen in the early 20th century was honoring and the enforcement of labor contracts. And so employees would sign contracts stating that they would earn a certain amount within a period of time, and that contract had to be honored, and thus firms were not able to lower wages as a result of this contractual obligation. So that kept the price level also from falling. Another reason why the price level was potentially not falling was due to worker resistance, workers maybe even collectively resisting, workers' resistance to wage cuts. And with that, I'd say number four, labor unions. All right, labor unions are beginning to gain strength in the early 20th century, late 1800s. And so labor unions collectively resist wage cuts as well. Okay, and again, that price level's not falling. Another reason, which I'll put down here, number five, is that you can even have the employer or the entrepreneur, all right, the employer or the entrepreneur, the owner of the firm, own resistance to wage cuts. Now you might ask, why would the owner of a firm resist cutting wages? Well, perhaps they've done it in the past and they reduced wages and they saw the impact of that. You would have reduced worker morale, which would translate to reduced productivity. So owners of companies, perhaps through experience, realize that reducing wages is actually a bad idea. It reduces worker morale, it reduces productivity, and that's something that an employer will resist to do. So as a result of these five variables and another variable called menu costs, which I'll discuss in another video, the price level was not falling. And as a result, the SRAS curve was prevented from falling. It was prevented from going to point C, as we've seen in a previous video, where SRAS would shift downward as a result of the unemployed factors of production being willing to reduce the income that they would receive. Previously in the 1800s, high levels of unemployment would lead to falling wages, falling rent, falling interest, falling profit. SRAS could thus shift downward and go to point C with a further decrease in the price level to PL3, as we've seen in a previous video. Okay, that's what would be expected by the monetarist economists. We would go from point A, from A to B, reduction in the quantity supplied, firing of resources, leading to increased unemployment and decreased spending, taking us into the recession. But those unemployed resources, you would expect those the prices of those resources to fall. And as wages, rent, interest, profit falls, SRS begins to shift downward. And then we go to point C, back to full employment, firms realizing that resources are now cheap. They will be willing to employ those cheap resources, and we're back at full employment. So we talked about this in the previous video. But in the 1930s, this was just not happening. And so Keynesian economists explained that in the short run, aggregate demand can actually get stuck at point D. And actually, the aggregate supply curve now has this shape. If I can begin to draw it. Okay, so the Keynesian aggregate supply curve has this type of shape. which we're going to talk about in the next video. So it highlights that there's a section of this new Keynesian aggregate supply curve that will not shift downward due to these 5 reasons that we've stated here. So the price level gets stuck. Aggregate demand, if it falls into recession, will get stuck at point D because the aggregate supply curve cannot shift downward. Okay? Now, with the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, Keynesian aggregate supply curve, because it cannot shift, everything is now dependent on aggregate demand. The Mattress Model says that the AD and the SRAS can move. But with the Keynesian aggregate supply curve, the Keynesian economists explain that the Keynesian aggregate supply curve does not shift. So everything is dependent on aggregate demand. And if we go back and look at the Great Depression and we see that consumption spending has fallen and investment spending has fallen, and we cannot control what foreigners do, we can't force them to buy more of our exports, Keynesian economists highlight that everything revolves around the government, or in this case, government spending. So when we go into recession and aggregate demand has fallen from 81 to 82 and we're at point D, the only way we can get out of the recession is through increased government spending. 82 will shift out to 81 and we will achieve full employment at point A. So hopefully this helps you understand how the Keynesian aggregate supply curve came into being. In the next video, we will dissect the Keynesian aggregate supply curve into its 3 sections and look at aggregate demand in these 3 sections. Okay, thank you so much. And that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. Take care.